Welcome to the Art of Marketing Operations, a Taylor podcast. I'm Glenn Bottomley, and today my guest is Mark Clark, Senior Marketing Operations Manager at Indivior, an organization working to change patients' lives by developing medicines to treat substance abuse disorders and serious mental illnesses. Thanks for joining me today, Mark.
Glenn, thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Well, to start out today, Mark, you have a vast amount of knowledge in the healthcare industry. And in fact, you got your Bachelor of Science degree in biology. So, what drew you to this area of expertise?
It's interesting, right? Everyone has a unique story, and I think mine also falls into that category. Even with the Bachelor of Science in biology, I did not see myself falling into healthcare, biotech, marketing operations certainly wasn't on the radar in my 20s. My father was an independent pharmacist. And so I spent years working with him and my family, small town Virginia, your quintessential pharmacy, one aisle right straight to the back. My father was a smoker, so the ash hanging off the cigarette and that sort of thing. But he was a great guy, and through my time working there, I had a ton of interactions with pharmaceutical sales reps. Those are sort of the golden days of pharmaceutical sales. Snazzy suits, shiny cars, trips with doctors, all the things that really don't happen nowadays. And so I said, oh, that's interesting. And I sort of put that in the back of my head as I progressed through a series of typical positions for 20-year-olds, cooking and bartending and all those sorts of things. I finally dropped into a company called Innovex, which is a sales company that provides adjunct sales forces to major pharmaceutical corporations. So that gave me my first break into pharmaceutical sales and the healthcare industry. And I really took to it. The sales portion of things worked really well for me. I found that I had a knack for speaking with people, and it wasn't difficult for me to speak to a neurosurgeon versus the person who's sweeping the floors up at night. So I could really run the gamut there. That progressed into a position with a company called Organogenesis. I spent 2 decades there. 75% of that was in field sales leadership, and a variety of other positions as a startup organization. And Organogenesis, of course, played in the realm of advanced wound care, so tissue engineering, skin equivalents, and those sorts of things. So a pretty unique corner of the industry, if you will. And then, of course, I worked my way up. One day I was approached to join the marketing team. I said, I never really thought about marketing, but okay, why not? Let's give it a chance. Stepped in as a subject matter expert, competitive intelligence expert, and that progressed and worked its way into the role of U.S. Director of Marketing Operations, a title, by the way, and a role that didn't exist at the company. And I find that that's pretty ubiquitous across industries. People would say, aha, I think we need to have a marketing operations person. So that became me. Learned trial by fire for 3 to 4 years. And then I've made my way over to Indivior at the beginning of this year, mimicking the same sorts of things that I was doing at Organogenesis, but in a company that's certainly rebuilding itself over the last couple of years.
What a fascinating background. It is awesome to share that in what I think is quite unique about your career background is that you've been in sales, as you just described, you've been in marketing. And now in marketing operations. So you've seen all three of these major disciplines. So from your perspective, how has that background and that experience in sales, marketing, and now marketing operations, how have those three different perspectives helped you develop better methods or increase efficiency in the work that you're doing day to day in marketing operations?
That's a great question. You don't really know what you have either until it's gone or until you have to really put it into effect. And so for me, especially stepping into the marketing operations world, what I ran into quite frequently, and even on the brand side a little bit, um, I found a lot of folks just didn't have that sales or field sales perspective. And I think that really hinders an organization when you have folks that are on the marketing team trying to get that messaging out, trying to make sure that everybody understands what your positioning is in the marketplace. If you don't have the ability to see what the sales reps see on a day-to-day basis, or you don't have the experience or knowledge to see what the sales leadership has to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And so for me, I found that things like understanding the perspective of the doctor. Sitting down with the doctor one on one as a marketer and conducting an interview similar to what you and I are doing right here, having a podcast type setting, that's great, but you may not be getting the real person behind the real thinking behind that individual's storefront. And so when you're in the field and you spend years working with doctors and nurse practitioners and PAs and the nursing staff, the C-suite, the administrative side, you really begin to formulate a full and total picture of what's going on the healthcare side of the business. And that translates really well into a role in marketing operations, where just about everything that I do has some sort of touch point, oftentimes multiple touch points out in the field. I don't have as much direct interaction anymore with the individuals in the field. The sales reps, yes, not the clinicians so much in my current role. My previous role at Organogenesis, I had a ton, and it was one of the things that I really loved. And you can guarantee that I'm moving towards that in my current role. That's one of the things that I'm looking forward to in the future. So, again, to wrap that up, having that full perspective from day to day, boots on the ground, interactions with clinicians, working that all the way through into the brand process, and then bringing it full circle into operations to make sure that there's a smooth continuum back and forth, I think is really key.
Yeah, I would agree with that. You and I have a very similar background, not from the industry, but in that experience in sales, my own personal career. I actually started in sales in print and
Yes.
went out into the field and sold commercial print and sold school yearbooks. And that whole experience of being in the field, living as a sales rep, I always describe it. I went to a different deli every single day for lunch. I was in the
Right.
field all day long, driving in the car, learning the techniques of drive to your furthest appointment in the morning, and work your way back to home, and just all of
Right.
the techniques that you get in the field. But it just made me a better marketer, and understanding now in terms of marketing print, how do you actually do that? What's the most important thing to know? So
Correct.
from your perspective, then, what opportunities, as well as challenges, then, have you faced throughout your career when, say, the strategy that you are working on, whether it's a marketing strategy, a marketing operations strategy, et cetera, let's say it
Sure.
is right on target
Right.
versus maybe not so much on target?
Yeah, and if you're not failing, then you're probably not doing things correctly, right?
Uh-huh.
Because you need to fail in order to succeed. Um, I'll stick with. I could probably tell you a million sales stories, and I'm sure you could share some of your own. I'll stick with marketing operations for this one. When I stepped into the role at my previous employer, truly there was no playbook. There was no design for marketing operations. Again, a position someone said, aha, we probably need someone to kind of wrap all these different things up. Um, and there was a lot, there was some mess. There were things that were just falling apart. And that was no fault of anybody at the organization until there was a one individual touch point or focal point for all of the operational needs. Everything was being piecemealed out to different individuals, right? Oftentimes brand team members. And being a brand marketer and being a marketing operations specialist, those are two very different things. So um, we'll talk about the win first. For me, one of the things that I was responsible for, and we don't have this capability at my current employer, we had a speakers bureau, right? So you're talking 100 plus HCPs. We would handle, anywhere from 600 to 700 product theater type events per year across the
Wow.
country. It was really an enormous undertaking. And of course, we partnered with a third party organization to help keep us in line, allegedly, to make sure that we were doing things correctly. So when I stepped in, I was familiar with the Speakers Bureau. I had run speaker programs as a rep, certainly had overseen them as a field leader. But now I was in the hot seat to make sure that the process was flowing correctly. And boy, was it not flowing correctly when I stepped in. So
Discovery
very
number
eye
one.
opening, right? And there you go, there you go. And so just I could talk about so much, but I think the most important win here was taking a look at the big picture. Again, it's all about the big picture. Okay, I had to have a ton of information fire hosed at me from all the different people that had been playing around with the bureau over the previous 3 to 4 years. Um, look for risks, right? I had to look for some big time risks for the organization, and there were some from a data reporting perspective, from compliance with Sunshine Act laws to make sure that we're reporting transfers of value. All of these things were just not being done in a very efficient manner. They were being done, but it was risky the way things were being handled. Um, we were losing money, on the speakers bureau. It just wasn't. It just wasn't worth the revenue that we were putting into it for what we were getting out of it. The speakers hadn't been trained in a year or two. That was an issue from a compliance standpoint. So all these things were out there. And for me, as I sat there over the first, we'll call it 30 to 60 days of my tenure, and I absorbed all this information and I worked with our third party vendor to figure out where they perceived the gaps to be, made sure that the company understood where we had some wins, but where we had some gaps. And then I had to take all of that and put it together into a structure that made sense, not only from a compliance and risk management standpoint, but from a revenue and operating standpoint, so that the field, the end users out in the field, and the speakers, the 100 or so HCPs who really look to us as the leader of this process, they felt good about being a member of that bureau. It took 30 to 60 days for me to understand and have the information together. We'll say it took another 9 to 12 months to really get that thing moving in the direction that it needed to move into.
Hmm.
So I'll call that a big win. And overall, we ended up saving a couple $100,000 along the way, which was not a bad thing for the folks up in the C-suite of my company.
Yeah.
From a win perspective, I checked that box for sure. Um, from a challenge that I faced that maybe didn't go as well as I thought. Um, we also had a process for approval of materials, relevant field materials, right? In healthcare, there's an awful lot of scrutiny on what sorts of white papers, information, promotional advertising materials a sales rep can put in front of an HCP, or even more, hand off to an HCP so they could walk away with it. And that process was called advertising and promotions, was the name of it. And it was a committee. And the committee was made up of, anywhere from 5 to 7 individuals. So you had folks from compliance, you had folks from executive leadership, we had a legal team, medical team, brand marketing, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, the operations guy. And my role was to, again, sort of clean up that process. The meeting was being held. It was being held face to face. This was pre-COVID. So every week, these folks would gather into a really hot, stuffy room with no windows and would sit there for hours and review material that was coming from various parts of the organization. More often than not, it was coming from brand marketing, but there were other parts of the organization that had things they wanted to get out as well. And it was painful, Glenn. I
Hmm.
mean, just
It
brutal,
sounds
right? And
brutal.
so we're not talking 30 minutes, we're talking 3 hours, and so couple of things. I had never been involved with that process before. So as I was observing and watching the transfers of information, how people were sharing documents and cleaning things up and making comments and finalizing, was inefficient, right? Very inefficient. We had no digitization, which was a compliance issue, no digitization of assets, which means you couldn't keep track of changes and when things would expire and you have to get something new. So there's just all sorts of holes there. And my quick recommendation to my boss at the time, the VP of marketing, was we need to find a company that we can partner with to help us capture this information more efficiently so that it's not just residing in an email inbox somewhere or sitting on somebody's server, right, in a file that maybe you can get to and maybe you can't. So she said, okay, give it a shot. I quickly went out. I vetted 3 vendors, went through the RFI, RFP process, and we came down to a company, and I'll leave their name out of it, but we came down to a company I thought was going to be really, really good.
Mhm.
They promised the world, so smooth. We integrate well with any system. Oh my gosh, you don't even have a system yet. This is going to be great. Again, 6 to 9 months down the road, it was a disaster. It was an absolute train wreck. We just couldn't get people on the same page, and we had varying levels of proficiency with IT. Now it's a more remote process versus this face-to-face meeting every week, which people hated, but they'd gotten used to. It's hard to teach an old dog new
Sure,
tricks, and
sure.
we had 5 to 7 of them there. So we did end up going with the digitized process, but the first swing was a big miss. And, that doesn't feel great when you talk about it. But at the end of the day, it was a learning lesson for me.
Yeah,
I was able to see more clearly, oh my gosh, here are the things I didn't even think about
yeah.
as I was going through this process. And now look where we are. Let's start over again and try to bring somebody in who can fill all these gaps.
Well, and to your point, you had to go through that to then know what a win would be. What you
That's right.
had to do, what you had to change. So to your point, sometimes you have to fail to ultimately succeed. The old
That's
line,
correct.
fail faster so you can succeed sooner. So it
Correct.
sounds certainly like that's a good example of that. Now, in your descriptions there, though, I heard compliance 3 times.
Yes.
And obviously in the healthcare space, pretty critical. So, from your perspective, how has the marketing operations discipline in healthcare been impacted by regulatory or legislative
Yeah.
issues, et cetera? And what do you sort of see on the horizon for marketing operations with things like obviously HIPAA, privacy,
Hmm.
GDPR, CCPA, other individual
Yeah.
rights, et cetera?
I tell you what, Glenn, it's going to be interesting to see how this all fleshes out. And for me, this is new turf for me, right? I have not had to deal with these some of these privacy testings, although compliance heavy certainly was my old organization, my previous organization, and my current organization, super compliance heavy. So I'm hearing more and more about this. When you and I first started talking, and I looked at some of the things that we might discuss today, I started to dive a little deeper into GDMP and all CCCP, the Colorado, and then I realized that I live in Virginia. And guess what? Virginia has one that's coming right down the barrel
Yeah.
in 2023. And so, you know, what I see is it's going to be incredibly challenging, not impossible, but incredibly challenging for organizations who are above that threshold of the number of folks that they're going to interact with, right? I think in Virginia, it's any customer database that's greater than 25,000 targets or something along those lines. So if you look at the way the regulations are written, and it's pretty standard across whether it's the Colorado, the California, the Virginia, the EU. It's pretty standard, and it basically says if I'm giving you my information, I have to believe that you are going to do a certain set of things with it. And I'm going to also have to believe that there's a huge set of things that you're not going to do with it, right? And I always have the capability to opt out of that.
Mhm.
Always. I can shut it off at a moment's notice as the consumer, as the person that you are targeting from the company. And I can tell you, my current organization seems to be pretty on the ball. I am not yet sure what the pathway is going, what's the vehicle going to be that's going to help drive our compliance with these things. Um, but when I look across, and I've talked to some of my other friends, and I have some folks in the family who are, startup business sorts of leaders, and they're struggling, right? They're struggling with how are they going to keep this straight. One person in particular, who's had a digital footprint for years now from the organizations that he started and been very successful with. His current organization is global, and it's all digital. It's all digital, and he is really stuck right now trying to figure out how in the next 6 months he's going to be able to meet the compliance needs of the organization, of the folks who are setting the rules, because one time, you mess up one time,
Mhm.
that can have an effect on your entire business flow,
Mhm.
right? It could shut you down
Mhm.
potentially. So the question for me is, what vehicles are going to rise to the surface, right? They're going to be the drivers of compliance for all of the different types of industries that need to follow this. And that I don't want to say the heyday, the party's not over for cookies and trails and data bits and all. It's not over. But it's certainly the fun police have come in and put the squash on some of the free for all that's been going on over the last 10 years. So to be continued.
The fun police. That's good. That's good. I like that. Well, you in your example there, you talked about that you make the wrong move there and it could shut you down. So to me, let's broaden that a little bit and talk about
Sure.
risk. Because in a sense that is that's one example of risk that you just
Yeah.
gave. So how do you see that marketing operations executive should incorporate risk assessment, let's say, or risk management into their strategies and tactics, particularly when the risk is to, like even in your example, the risk is to the corporate brand or to the corporation.
Correct. Maybe I was a little over the top. I don't think one
Oh,
time if you
sure.
make
No,
a
I
mistake,
understand.
they're going to come run in and shut your company down. But certainly there's going to be a pathway if you're caught, right, doing something, you know, doing this. Pause for a second. 5, 4, 3. You said pause for 5 seconds. Sorry. Okay, we'll go back. So again, I think that no one's going to come in and just shut your company down over one little mistake. However, the pathway that's going to be created or that's being created as we speak to rectify that situation might be more painful than just implementing something on the front end. I suspect it will be. So when you talk about minimizing risk or risk management, right? The definition of risk management is the process of finding, assessing, and controlling threats to your company's financial security more than anything, right? Companies are in business to make money, to have revenue. So from a marketing operations perspective, particularly, I mean, it started off in my previous company, there were so many holes with regards to risk. I mean, the biggest one there was the Sunshine Act reporting, right? So how do you mitigate that? Well, number one, you have to understand what does the Sunshine, I'll use that as an example. What does the Sunshine Act say, right? What does it mean? How is it defined? What are the parameters? What are the things that you are required to do as an organization? And then from an ops management perspective, back into that, right? Okay, well, here's the list. Let me say, are we doing this? Are we doing this? We're not doing that. We have to do this. And now we have a truncated time frame to make sure that we're getting there. Going hand in hand with that, though, is we have to communicate. I say we, I mean the industry has to communicate to those folks that are going to be assessing whether or not we are running a risky business, right? If we work in a vacuum, we're doing all these things. We know we have some problems here. We know, but we're not telling anybody about it except for the internal stakeholders, which they should all know about it. And that's another element is incorporating risk management into the culture so that everyone can be a piece of it. But if we're not communicating with the outside entities, whether it's the DOJ or whoever it might, OIG, whoever it might be within the United States government, they don't know what we're doing. All they see is what's on the platform, right? And they're just going to tear that apart. And then it's a scramble to fix that. So operations is all about process improvement, efficiencies, making sure that things are working well all the time. And if they're not, where are the gaps? Where are the risks? How can we fill those in and fix them and make sure, by the way, that they don't happen again?
Hmm.
Things are always going to pop up, but we have to be thorough and vigilant to make sure that we cover A to Z at all times.
Yeah, no, I think that that's good, and it's an interesting segue that you mentioned because you said the processes and efficiencies, and so when I hear those two words, where that starts to lead me to is to scale, and so what I'm curious about then is what have you found to be the best ways to create marketing operation strategies that do scale? So, in other words, what have been in your career some of the keys to the success in this area? Like, is it MarTech platforms? You talked about repeatable processes or
Yeah.
efficient processes. Is it the team? Is it the right market timing, being in the right place at the right time? Are there even other factors? So, what are your thoughts in terms of building strategies at scale?
Yeah, it's an evolution, right? Not a revolution. And so for me, what I have witnessed and experienced is that there's a couple of key things on the front end that really make things on the back end flow smoothly. Number one is, and this is across both organizations that I've worked for, is breaking down barriers, right? Many organizations still operate with a silo mentality. They talk about they don't want to do that. Oh, no, no, no. We are collaborative. We are cross-functional. Lots of stakeholders. We're all in this together. But in the day-to-day, you end up finding out that sales is here, marketing is here, operations is here, compliance is here, and that's just difficult to make sure that you are checking all the boxes and you're scaling up correctly for the things that need to be done to grow the business. And so luckily, in having a sales background and just being able to break down some of these barriers, not everybody that's in the corporate setting has the understanding and background of what it's like to be a human, right? To understand that, you and I may do different things in this organization, but inevitably we're going to cross over. So we need to work together. Let's stop sending each other 15 emails a day. How about let's talk face to face?
Hmm.
Pick up the phone and call me. It's amazing. It is amazing to me, Glenn. I've seen it over and over again. Mark, we have this problem with this process. We need to grow this. We need to grow that. But man, I just can't get this individual to respond to me, or this person won't get back to me and tell me what I need. And they'll say, look at this email, and there's 25 emails back and forth, ping, 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 ping. I said, well, have you picked up the phone and called them? Where
Hmm.
do they sit? Are they in the building?
Right.
Let's go
Just walk
talk to them.
over.
Problem solved.
Yeah.
It's amazing to me. And still to this day, I mean, I think it's even worse now in some ways with with social media and everyone's got their phone and the texting. And I see it with my kids, it's hard for them to have a face-to-face conversation sometimes. We have to slap the phone out of their hands. And so I think that when it comes to scaling, it's important that we reestablish sort of the human parameter. That's an important piece of this, so that everybody says, okay, we can all get along. The next step is, okay, where do all of these processes come together, right? There has to be a very good elucidation from the leadership, typically in operations, that says, okay, well, compliance and sales and brand all come together in these three areas, right? And if we make that stronger, that's going to scale up our business. That's going to generate more revenue for us, more leads, more capabilities for the sales folks. So that's the second piece. The third piece is, how do we track it, right? How do we keep the data straight? And this is the one where I find myself behind the eight ball, honestly. Um, for me, the MarTech stack, right? The stacking of the technology, we don't have it. So many companies don't have it. And my previous organization had nothing, to track anything. My current organization has some homemade things to track, and they're not great. And I've been, my boss and I talk about it all the time. So one of my objectives right now, I'm going through this process right now, is to understand where organizations, and I'll throw a name out there, I don't mind, HubSpot, right? I've been in deep conversations with them, looking at all their capabilities across not only brand marketing and marketing operations, but sales and customer relationship management. They Organizations like HubSpot, or companies like HubSpot, they seem to get that you have to find a way to capture everybody's information. You can still segment it out any way you want to. You can slice and dice that data all day long. But if you're not capturing everything, you have no way to track. You don't know what's working. More importantly, you don't know what's not working. And when you talk about scale, the things that aren't working are going to far overshadow the things that are working
Yeah.
in most cases.
Because it magnifies.
It
Yeah.
does, absolutely. And so for me, I'm deep diving into HubSpot every day. I have another meeting with them next week. I'm actually pretty excited. I will be a HubSpot certified champion soon. So there's your shout out, HubSpot.
Well,
Free pub for you.
there you go. Well, but you talked a little bit about how you work together, across an organization. Just instead of sending the email, just walk over and just ask a question, or just
Yes.
meet with someone. That's really key. But then the data that you're talking about, I'm also curious about your view in your experiences about also reporting to executive management. So we've talked about sort of the lateral, but let's also talk about going up. So, obviously having the data, to your point, if you don't have the data, that's obviously one of the key things is getting the data. But assuming you have the data and you are tracking certain, key metrics, what's some of the rule of thumbs that you use to ensure that you're presenting the most important or the most relevant information to senior management?
That's a great ask. So, not all executives are built the same, right? Some folks want to see graphs and charts. They all want to see the hockey stick, right? They want to see the hockey stick. Everybody wants to see that. But, some folks are just data hounds, right? I'm a data hound. And that's, so for me, that's a comfort zone. I don't mind deep diving. But some folks want to see pretty pictures and flowy presentations and lots of exciting graphics. And so, first of all, you have to know your audience. That's the first thing, right? If you're gonna send stuff up the chain, make sure you know who's going to be in the room, what is it that are their hot points, their triggers, and make sure you're speaking to the right folks in the right way. That's the first thing. For me, when it comes to collating this data and making sure that I'm putting together a presentation that really touches on the high points, I mean, there's some things that go over the top all the time. If it's making money, then folks want to see it. So if it's driving revenue, let's give that its due on the presentation. Number one. Number two, we talked earlier about managing risk, right? CEOs, C-suite individuals, good Lord, they do not want to talk about, they don't want to hear about another risky endeavor, right? That where are we going to get killed next year from that, agency or that agency because we haven't done these things correctly. So make sure that there's a touch always on, here's where our compliance status is. Here are the things that we've analyzed and said, we're pretty good here. We know there's a lot of oversight in these areas. We're okay, but there's still one or two, no more than three things that we've got to work on. And here are some ways that we get there. So you got to touch on that too. So it's revenue, it's compliance and risk, and it's also operational efficiency. There's always got to be a plug for that. And the reason there has to be a plug for it, it's not the most sexy thing. I think it's sexy. Not everybody does. Not everyone gets jazzed up to say, the process is so super smooth now. Way to go, Mark. It has to be out there. If we don't plug for it, then people quickly forget. They look at the hockey stick and they look at the compliance issues, and that's it. Presentation's over. You got to give a plug for how did we get here? What are we doing to get better? How can we continue to grow this business in the right way with these different avenues and things to think about? Not all of them are going to work, but here are the things that we should be considering.
Wise advice. Excellent. Well, Mark, before we wrap up today's episode, what is the main takeaway that you want to leave our audience with in understanding the challenges facing marketing operations executives today?
Well, Glenn, first of all, thank you for the time today. I really appreciate it. And I've given this one some thought. Not that anyone is approaching me, asking me for marketing operations advice, not yet. But the thing that I have experienced, and I'm still experiencing it now, 6, 7 years later, marketing operations changes all the time, right? What my role, the definition of my particular role when I stepped into marketing operations is so different now from what it was then, right? There's always things being added in and taken out. We talked about, tracking of data and making sure that we've got a process flow that makes sense. Can we hold people accountable? Can we assign individuals to be responsible so it's not just out there floating in the ether that we hope projects get done on time and get done under budget? So I think that being flexible is so important, right? Which is why having a sales background, I think, is really good for this type of role, because you have to be nimble. Secondarily to that, got to stay sharp. And that means looking to do things that are outside of the comfort zone, that are outside of the wheelhouse. And, for me, it's diving into the data and making sure that we're tracking these processes efficiently. And then the final thing I would encourage people to keep in mind and use as they progress their career is that there's always a need for people who understand how operations fits into the business, right? It's not just look at the spreadsheet, pick out a few numbers that look good, pick out a few that look bad, and then work back from there. There's so much more to it. There's so many different nuances, and the interaction that being in an operations, specifically a marketing operations role, the interactions that you're granted access to are invaluable. You will definitely have touch points across whatever organization you're working for if you go into this role. If that's something that gets you excited, jump into marketing operations. Come join me.
Well, that's excellent. Well, that wraps up this episode of The Art of Marketing Operations. Thank you so much for joining us today, Mark.
Yes, Glenn, thank you very much. It's been my pleasure. I've really enjoyed this time together.
Wonderful. Well, until next time, stay safe, take care, and thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening to The Art of Marketing Operations, brought to you by Taylor. Don't forget to hit subscribe in your favorite podcast player. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, and share. Until next time.